for change erupted in May of 2020. After George Floyd was murdered during an arrest at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis.
No, let him keep that like that. You don't let him feel bad about yourself. Go ahead.
Those calls grew in April of 2021 when Dante Wright was killed by an officer in Brooklyn Center.
Nothing is more damaging to police-community relations than the excessive or unnecessary use of force.
So what is the state of policing in Minnesota?
We hope that police will change their practices, they will get more training, and approach protests with more respect for people's First Amendment rights.
Over the next hour, WCCO will take you inside for the first time.
Knees are not on the subject, knees are on the ground.
To see how police are trained.
This topic is one of the biggest topics in policing in America today. When we use force, how we treat people, how we approach situations. And it's the biggest liability.
Listen to community members calling for transparency.
You know, as a minority community, we're afraid to call the police because every time we call the police, one of our community member dies or injured.
This is a nationwide effort, but it takes all of us to do this.
And hear from police chiefs who are at the center of it all.
Problem solving is probably the most important.
Absolutely.
And we train officers to make split-second decisions, but we also need to make sure that they have the ability to slow things down when they can.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about the state of policing. I'm Jennifer Merrily. We've heard you asking for transparency when it comes to how police are trained and how they interact with the community, specifically when it comes to use of force. WCCO photojournalist Grant Verdon and I started this project with the goal of giving you an in-depth look at that training, spending months talking with police and hearing from you, the people they serve. We invited the two biggest departments in Minnesota to participate. Minneapolis Police declined our invitation. St. Paul Police said yes. And for the first time, the department authorized unrestricted access to record their quarterly training. The department reports it's reduced use of force by 37%. They credit some of that to a change in training they made in 2015. Going from use of force training to response to resistance or aggression, or RRA training. The department calls it an overhaul. We talked with Chief Todd Axtell before he retired about supporting the move and the progress made.
I am incredibly and deeply honored to serve as your next St. Paul Police Chief.
Todd Axtell says when he became police chief in St. Paul, he knew training needed an update.
We had, more uses of force and more injuries of suspects and officers, and things just weren't working to the standard that we needed at the time.
As he came up the ranks over his 33-year career, he says initially there were 3 steps in using force.
You ask them, you tell them, and then you make them. And it really didn't matter how long it took to get between each of those steps.
He says that was in line with training and policy.
For the decades, our training unit has really found out that officers need scenarios where they can win without laying hands on, where you can talk your way out of a situation, where you can de-escalate successfully.
He knows in certain instances force will be necessary. In those cases, he expects 3 things to be true.
It has to be reasonable, necessary, and done with respect.
What made you say we're going to be at the forefront of changing training and looking at what's needed and what's next?
This topic is one of the biggest topics in policing in America today. When we use force, how we treat people, how we approach situations. And it's the biggest liability. Cities across this country and counties across this country are paying millions upon millions of dollars as a result of unnecessary uses of force.
The highest year payout for St. Paul was 2017 at $2.3 million. It's gone down every year after.
The proof is in the pudding. This is working. It's not just about the money. It's about the trust, the confidence, and the way the people view their police department, not the police department, their police department.
We will begin with just a warm-up.
He says that's part of the strategy behind response to resistance or aggression.
To maintain distance, try to de-escalate them.
A mindset shift, Axtell says, that was originally met with pushback, then acceptance and buy-in.
So we made a commitment. We are going to invest more time and more money into our training unit to make sure that we reduce the likelihood that those things will happen. They will happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. But if you can reduce the number of time, you build trust and you save your city money at the same time.
If you want different performance, then you have to give people the tools to do.
Yeah, depending on level of resistance, it might be enough just to control my hand.
Sergeant Sean Zahar oversees the RRA training program.
We kind of primarily used concepts from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and some wrestling techniques where we could take officers of smaller stature and could use these techniques against people that were a lot larger than them more effectively and using less force overall.
These are the most common areas where officers were either assaulted or force was used.
He walked us through the reasoning behind RRA and says academy training went from 80 hours to 120.
Now our focus is leverage-based control. So using your body weight to physically control somebody, not waiting for the compliance necessarily to get them into custody. So just our ability to control someone effectively and get them in the handcuffs quicker is safer for everyone.
Chemical irritant use is down.
And he shared stats. Sergeant Zahar has his PhD and worked with an outside analyst to look at use of force before and after shifting to RRA.
We had like 37% reduction in force overall. Strikes were down nearly 69% over that 5-year average. Use of the taser, use of our pepper spray were down. And people mostly, when they had to use force, they relied on those empty hand control techniques.
The study shows officers came into contact with more people who aggressively resisted, including a 15% increase in people with weapons.
Here's our classroom portion.
At the same time, other training complemented RRA, like implicit bias, moral courage, and crisis intervention. Zahar says subject injuries went down, so did officer injuries.
We have such a limited amount of time to do training. It has to be beneficial and it has to be impactful.
Squads are still being used.
To stay on top of use of force, there's a weekly review meeting by the command staff. The training unit looks at body-worn camera videos.
We don't need our community to come to us to say something went bad. That's our job.
Axtell says it all adds up to better and safer interactions between police and the community they serve. They're okay showing what they're doing to make improvements.
Every positive interaction we have with the community, every deposit with the media where we can show the work in a transparent way that we're doing is a deposit into that very important bank of trust.
Use of force calls account for 0.2% of the calls in St. Paul. Last year, that was 575 for 240,104 incidents. We've added the use of force study to WCCO.com/links. St. Paul Police gave us full access to record quarterly RRA training. It is a requirement for all officers. Training typically starts with some work in the classroom. Trainers go over law or policy. They might review video of techniques from other departments where things didn't go well, and then they head downstairs to begin. The first stop is here at the locker, so officers can lock up the tools on their belt, like their service weapon and taser. Inside the mat room, they're checked. The officers replace those tools with training handcuffs, a replica handgun that's weighted to mimic the real thing, a taser, and fake pepper spray. Then it's time for training to start.
We will begin with just a warm-up of 2 officers standing handcuffing.
Mat training goes about an hour each quarter.
Make some type of eye contact and move in at the same time here. Sir, you are under arrest.
With each technique, there's a demonstration.
And our goal here is to grab for that upper arm. We'll do this for anyone who is either completely compliant or maybe even a low level of resistance. We're grabbing that upper arm. My lead hand slides down to the wrist, and we guide that hand behind the back. If no questions, let's split up into groups of 3 and get some reps. We're ready to break. The techniques that we use now more rely on what we call soft, empty hand techniques, techniques that are more scalable, we call it. We rely on grappling. Grappling meaning techniques that use timing and leverage, designed for even a smaller officer to overcome even a larger, more aggressive subject.
Trainers offer guidance.
And Commander, you step with your right foot right behind hers. There you go.
And corrections throughout.
So ideally, see how she's got her hand laced through the front? Yep. And then maintain control with this hand right on the wrist. We'll form two lines.
We set up 2 static cameras to capture every angle of training.
Officers, you're covering your head. You're closing that distance.
Plus, photojournalist Grant Verdon rolled on the entire training with a 3rd camera, moving around the room to capture the movements closer up. What you're seeing are the camera shots edited together.
Reset. My favorite thing about the techniques that you saw would be the team techniques. We have used 2-officer handcuffing, our 2-officer takedown, our 2-officer ground kind of control and handcuffing techniques to solve the vast majority of the situations that have arisen on the street in the last few years, where we have a subject who resists us, but we do have those multiple officers on scene. This 2-officer takedown, one of us grabs that rear clinch, the other grabs those legs. We can control the rate of descent of the subject. I'm simply taking a couple steps back, bending at the knee, and allowing the subject's weight to slide down to the ground. We're intentionally putting them on their back. We want them on their back so we can continue to control those hands so that we don't create that situation where they're face down, we can't see hands, they might be accessing weapons. We'll communicate from here. All right, he is down resisting, let's turn him over. Partner comes off those legs. I simply give my partner one of those arms. He pins it right above the subject's head. I pull the other arm low to the ground. We get him turned over. And we get those hands behind the back. Prone handcuffing, super important. Knees are not on the subject. Knees are on the ground. Very important, though, that we have them in contact with the subject's hip and just above the subject's shoulder. It's going to take away that side-to-side wiggle room that the subject has. I'm going to use my arm that's closest to his head and grip the wrist. That elbow drops down in that shoulder crease, right where the tricep meets the upper back there. I can drop that elbow to try to pin that shoulder point to the ground. My other hand grips the wrist, and I tuck my elbow right against my hip. We're going to control those hands behind the back. At this point, we do have them controlled, so we can safely access cuffs. Does not matter which hand I cuff with.
I've seen this since my beginning of my career here in St. Paul. It starts with our academy. In the academy, we get the small details. When we're here, it's just the repetitiveness of it.
Officer Brianna Kitch joined St. Paul Police 4 years ago.
Excellent, very nice.
She says learning these techniques makes her more confident in the field.
For me, being a female and a smaller stature female, these techniques I love to take to the street because I can take down somebody bigger and stronger than me. And I have the confidence of knowing, hey, I can do this without hurting myself and without hurting them as well.
I'm dropping the weapon side elbow down, reaction side elbow up.
The idea behind response to resistance or aggression, or RRA training, is to give officers options when they encounter people on the job, so they don't have to escalate to higher uses of force.
This is about control. Engaging physically, might look rough, but in all actuality, what we're doing are trained tactics that are very safe. And the idea is we're doing them because we don't want to cause injury.
Sergeant David McCabe says he pays attention and knows what he's learning here can make a difference out there.
We might have been smiling or giggling or whatever because, we're with our friends. But in the back of the mind, everybody's picturing, okay, I'm at a bar and there's a bar fight and somebody comes at me. Putting these tactics into context is really what takes it to the next level.
Very nice, Paul.
You did each one for a couple minutes. Is that enough?
That's a great question. There's no doubt that I would not turn down additional training time. We've made it very retainable. Most of the techniques are very simple. Our 2-officer takedown, somebody's grabbing the upper body of the subject and somebody's grabbing the legs of the subject. There's not much to it. Generally, the techniques are very forgiving, meaning if you do forget even 20, 30, 40% of the details, it'll still almost certainly work on the street.
As we mentioned, we set up 3 cameras to capture different angles of training. We edited those cameras together to give you the full look at what we saw. You can watch the raw training video at WCCO.com. Look for this story. The training is complete and nothing has been edited out. We were also there to capture some of the latest Academy class in mid-September. The class of 25 went through scenario training. We're told by the time this happens, the class has learned concepts and the reason behind them, plus basic skills. Then they are put through scenarios, practicing RRA skills, de-escalation, and crisis intervention in a real-time but controlled atmosphere. Several departments have modeled their training after St. Paul's RRA. St. Paul's trainers developed a way to train other agencies in the tactics. So far, more than 140 departments have sent someone to learn RRA. That includes all of these agencies in the past year. We can see how that training played out in real time. St. Paul Police shared dash cam video of RRA training tactics being used during a call in 2020. Police tell us officers responded to a man in possession of a stolen vehicle. You can see two officers approach on either side of the subject. Sergeant Sean Zahar walks us through it.
Attempted two-officer handcuffing didn't work. Two-officer takedown.
The officers are there on the ground with the person. Take a look. You'll notice the same tactic taught in RRA training.
They're just controlling his hands. Got one officer in the mount position. Do a turn over here in a second.
Here's another side-by-side from training. The officers turn the person over from lying on his back to being on his stomach.
Security hands behind his back. You can see they're not on top of him at all. They're on the sides.
They search him and we're told make the arrest. At the heart of all of this, community and how police interact with the people they're supposed to protect and serve. We gathered a group of invested Minnesotans to talk about training, their thoughts on what they saw and what they'd like to see moving forward. Plus, police reform at the state capitol, what's changed and what's still being talked about when we come back.